So what do you have? You have a soup of hiding a bad lie. Yeah, well, again, it's not about throwing your friends under the bus. We have the government cover-up. That's the one that has to be protected.
McCann's corpse was transported in the McCann's Renault Scenic hire car some weeks after she died. I believe there has been a high-level cover-up about what really happened.
Nós começamos a pensar nos pais como suspeitos, porque aquilo é uma encenação de trio.
On the night of May 3, 2007, the quiet holiday town of Praia da Luz, Portugal, became the stage for one of the most haunting mysteries of our time, the disappearance of 3-year-old Madeleine McCann. What began as a family vacation quickly spiraled into a global obsession. Her face, blonde hair, wide, innocent eyes, was suddenly everywhere. Posters lined the streets, news reports dominated the airwaves, and Madeleine's name echoed across continents. The world was captivated, united in shock, fear, and sympathy. And yet, from the very beginning, something didn't sit right. The story told by the media was almost too clean, too perfect. A child abducted in the dead of night, devastated parents begging for answers, and an urgent international manhunt. But when investigators stepped into apartment 5A, the place where Madeleine was last seen, what they found didn't match the narrative. No broken locks, no signs of forced entry, no chaos that usually accompanies a burglary or abduction. Everything looked strangely undisturbed. This contradiction sparked the question that still lingers today. Was Madeleine truly taken by an intruder, or was there another truth hidden behind the polished headlines? 17 years later, the case remains unsolved, tangled in speculation, unanswered questions, and conflicting accounts. Perhaps it is the silence, the gaps between what we were told and what the evidence shows, that continues to pull us back into this mystery. From the very first hours after Madeleine McCann was reported missing, the abduction theory dominated headlines. According to this version, someone had entered apartment 5A of the Ocean Club Resort, while her parents, Kate and Jerry McCann, were dining with friends nearby and taken Madeleine into the night. It was a story that captured hearts around the globe. The image of an innocent child ripped from her bed by a faceless predator. It was simple, emotionally compelling, and it fueled an international call to action. Posters were printed, press conferences were held, and donations poured in. For many, the narrative seemed undeniable. But beneath the surface, cracks began to appear. When investigators examined the apartment, they were struck by what was missing. There was no forced entry. Windows and shutters remained intact, the doors unbroken. The children's beds were neatly made, and nothing suggested a violent intrusion. Eyewitness accounts of a suspicious figure were vague, inconsistent, or unverified. What should have been a chaotic scene of intrusion was, instead, oddly calm and orderly. Even more troubling were the inconsistencies in the statements given by those closest to the McCanns. Friends who dined with the couple that evening, the group later known as the Tapas 7, gave accounts of child-checking routines, open doors, and timelines that didn't always align. To some, these contradictions were small errors of memory in a moment of panic. To others, they signaled deeper issues, suggesting that the official story might not reflect the full truth. Then came the forensic questions. Cadaver dogs alerted to the scent of human decomposition inside the apartment and later in the McCann's rental car, weeks after Madeleine's disappearance. Traces of biological material were found, but were later dismissed, downplayed, or left unexplained. These anomalies only fueled suspicion that the truth was more complicated than the abduction narrative suggested. As time passed, alternative theories began to take shape. Could Madeleine's death have occurred inside the apartment, perhaps by accident, and been concealed? Could the story of abduction have been a narrative constructed in haste, then reinforced by media and political forces until it became nearly untouchable? While millions believed in the official theory, a growing number of investigators, journalists, and ordinary people could not ignore the contradictions. The deeper they looked, the more they saw a case riddled with unanswered questions, questions that the abduction story alone could not explain. Among the independent voices who challenged the mainstream narrative was Bernd Stellander, a retired Norwegian military police officer. Unlike traditional investigators who focused on tracking down an external suspect, Stellander turned his attention inward, toward the behaviors, routines, and subtle actions of those closest to Madeleine. His belief was simple, but profound. In moments of high stress, words can deceive, but actions often reveal hidden truths. Stellander carefully studied the movements of Kate and Jerry McCann, as well as their circle of friends, both in public and in private. He noted patterns that others overlooked, ritualized behaviors, repeated visits to certain places, and the quiet placement of symbolic objects. One location in particular captured his attention, a discreet hillside he called Spot 1, overlooking the town of Praia da Luz. At this site, Stellander documented striking details: a heart-shaped arrangement of stones, the letter M formed from twigs, a fresh pink flower delicately placed in the soil. To a casual observer, these might seem sentimental or coincidental, but to Stellander, they suggested deliberate, repeated acts, rituals tied to someone emotionally bound to Madeleine. He believed these were not random gestures of grief, but forensic clues pointing to a deeper, unspoken connection. What intensified his suspicion was what came next. Weeks after Madeleine's disappearance, Stellander's hidden cameras recorded Kate and Jerry McCann themselves visiting Spot 1, quietly, secretly, and without their other children or any media presence. Their visits were careful, measured, and private, sharply contrasting with the desperate public image they projected to the world. Stellander began to see a troubling psychological pattern. He coined it romanticizing the grave, a form of coping rooted in guilt and responsibility. According to him, Kate McCann's repeated visits, her placement of flowers and mementos, and her controlled, ritualized behavior were not typical of parents who believed their child had been abducted and might still be alive. Instead, they aligned with behaviors of someone privately acknowledging a loss that could not be openly admitted. Even the smallest details mattered. Items left behind, photographs, trinkets, and personal belongings of Madeleine were arranged with care, not scattered impulsively. Their consistency over time suggested deliberate curation, almost like a signature. To Stellander, these actions were evidence not just of grief, but of atonement, an attempt to manage guilt through quiet ritual rather than frantic searching. His conclusion was not that he held definitive answers, but that these behavioral patterns demanded attention. In his eyes, what people do when unobserved can speak louder than any testimony. And in the case of the McCanns, their secretive connection to Spot 1 raised questions the official story of abduction could never fully explain. If Bernd Stellander approached the case through the lens of behavior, Gonçalo Amaral, the former lead investigator for Portugal's Polícia Judiciária, brought a sharp forensic eye. From the outset, Amaral was skeptical of the abduction narrative. When he first entered apartment 5A on the night of May 3, 2007, what he saw did not resemble a break-in. There were no forced locks, no shattered windows, no overturned furniture. The rooms were tidy, the children's beds neatly made. For Amaral, this absence of chaos told its own story. If a stranger had entered, there should have been signs. Amaral's doubts deepened as forensic measures were conducted. Cadaver dogs trained to detect the scent of human decomposition alerted strongly inside the apartment, particularly near areas connected to Madeleine's sleeping space. Later, in a Renault Scenic rental car the McCanns used weeks after the disappearance, the dogs again signaled, one detecting decomposition, the other detecting traces of blood in the trunk. In Amaral's experience, such alerts demanded serious follow-up. Yet, to his frustration, these findings were minimized, dismissed, or quietly set aside in official reports. To Amaral, this disregard reflected a larger failure, allowing narrative and public sentiment to guide conclusions rather than evidence. He believed the indicators pointed toward a possibility few wanted to acknowledge, that Madeleine may have died inside the apartment, and that the abduction story was constructed afterward to conceal that truth. The obstacles Amaral faced were not purely forensic. The case quickly drew international attention, and with it came political and media pressure. Within hours of the disappearance, a global campaign presented Kate and Jerry McCann as grieving parents of an abducted child. A British government media advisor, Clarence Mitchell, was assigned to manage their communications. News outlets around the world repeated the abduction theory without question. In this environment, Amaral's alternative line of inquiry became increasingly difficult to pursue. He later observed that investigators were caught between evidence that suggested one scenario and a tidal wave of public sentiment insisting on another. Diplomatic involvement from the British government further complicated matters, making it nearly impossible for local police to follow uncomfortable leads without risking political fallout. Amaral also scrutinized the testimonies of the Tapa 7, the friends who dined with the McCans that night. Their accounts of child checks, door positions, and timings varied in subtle but significant ways. Combined with the absence of forced entry and the unexplained forensic alerts, these inconsistencies strengthened Amaral's suspicion that Madeleine's death had occurred inside the apartment rather than at the hands of a stranger. His conclusions were controversial and drew fierce criticism, yet Amaral insisted that his role was to follow the evidence, wherever it led, even when that path defied the popular narrative. His perspective underscored a simple principle. In criminal investigation, truth must come from facts, not from the most emotionally palatable story. While Amaral focused on forensic evidence and Stellander on behavioral cues, Richard D. Hall, an independent investigative journalist, turned his attention to the machinery of media itself. For Hall, the mystery of Madeleine McCann was not only about what happened inside apartment 5A, but also about how the story was constructed, repeated, and cemented in the public's mind. From the very beginning, Hall noted, the abduction narrative was broadcast globally with extraordinary speed. Headlines screamed of a child kidnapped in the night. Television anchors repeated the word abduction long before forensic teams had completed their initial work. Within hours, the McCans were portrayed as innocent victims, their daughter a symbol of lost innocence. The story spread like wildfire, and soon, questioning it became almost unthinkable. Hall asked a simple but unsettling question. Why was this version of events accepted so quickly, and with so little empirical support? When he reviewed the apartment evidence, he found nothing that confirmed the presence of an intruder. No forced entry, no broken locks or windows, no fingerprints or footprints belonging to an outsider. The children's room remained neatly arranged. For Hall, this pristine condition clashed with the idea of a chaotic, secretive abduction. He also scrutinized the behavior of Kate and Jerry McCann in the critical hours after Madeleine vanished. Instead of scouring the resort, knocking on doors, or organizing frantic searches as most parents might, they moved rapidly toward the media. They issued statements, gave interviews, and positioned themselves as the faces of a global campaign. To Hall, this response felt rehearsed, more consistent with managing a narrative than reacting to a personal catastrophe. Then there were the cadaver dog alerts, both in the apartment and in the rental car. Forensic traces that hinted at decomposition or blood were sidelined, minimized, or buried in reports. Hall argued that these details were not simply overlooked. They were actively deprioritized in favor of sustaining the abduction storyline. In his view, the case became less an investigation and more a media event, one where perception mattered more than truth. Hall's conclusion was not to accuse, but to warn. He believed the Madeleine McCann case illustrated how powerful media framing can be, how swiftly it can close doors to alternative explanations, and how easily public sympathy can be channeled into a single narrative, regardless of evidence. For him, the greatest danger lay not only in what might have happened to Madeleine, but in how the truth could be obscured by a story that the world had already chosen to believe. Beyond the McCans themselves, one of the most curious elements of the Madeleine McCann case lies in the testimony of their friends, those who dined with them on the night of May 3, 2007. Known collectively as the Tapa 7, this group has stood by a single, remarkably consistent narrative for nearly 2 decades. Despite countless police interviews, media scrutiny, and reviews of the case, not one member has deviated from the story they told in those first days. At first glance, such consistency might appear to be a sign of reliability. Yet for independent investigators like Bernd Stellander, Gonzalo Amaral, and Richard D. Hall, the unshakable uniformity of their accounts raises difficult questions. Memory is imperfect. In stressful moments, people forget details, timelines blur, and accounts diverge. But here, over 17 years, details remain nearly identical. Who checked on which children, the times of those checks, and the sequence of events around the apartment. When examined closely, however, small cracks appear. Witnesses disagreed on whether doors were open or closed, shutters up or down, and the precise timing of movements. These discrepancies were never reconciled, and yet, instead of adjusting their accounts over time, as most people naturally do when memories are revisited, the Tapa 7 held firm, repeating the same story with striking rigidity. Psychologists describe this as a form of group entrapment, where collective silence or cohesion is used as protection. For individuals in high-profile cases, especially doctors, professionals, and academics, as many of the Tapa 7 were, the stakes of admitting even a small inconsistency could be devastating. To alter their statements might risk accusations of obstruction, perjury, or complicity. Consistency became their shield, even if it meant glossing over contradictions. There is also the phenomenon of contaminated or collective memory. Over years of repeating their story, rehearsing it for police, the press, and among themselves, their recollections may have converged into a single, polished version. What began as individual memories evolved into a group narrative, smooth, unyielding, and resistant to challenge. For investigators, this uniformity is troubling. It does not necessarily point to guilt, but it does suggest a psychological mechanism at play, one designed to preserve unity and avoid exposure. In the Madeleine McCann case, the Tapa 7's unwavering testimony stands less as proof of truth than as evidence of how fear, loyalty, and self-preservation can shape human behavior. Their silence, their sameness, may protect them, but it also obscures the cracks in the timeline, the very cracks that could hold the key to what really happened that night. If the inconsistencies of the case were troubling, the way the narrative was managed in the public eye added an entirely new layer of complexity. Within hours of Madeleine's disappearance, the story of abduction was not just reported, it was curated, shaped, and broadcast to the world with precision. At the center of this orchestration stood Clarence Mitchell, a former British government communications officer, brought in as the McCann's spokesperson. His role went beyond relaying updates. It was to frame the family's image, control the messaging, and ensure that the McCanns were perceived as sympathetic victims in a global drama. The results were immediate and powerful. Headlines across the United Kingdom and beyond painted the picture of a child, stolen from her bed by a faceless predator. News bulletins emphasized the innocence of Madeleine, the desperation of her parents, and the urgent threat posed by an unseen abductor. This emotionally charged narrative spread faster than any forensic investigation could hope to keep up with. And with each passing day, it solidified further, leaving little room for alternative theories. For investigators like Amaral, Stellander, and Hall, this created what they later described as a narrative firewall. Any suggestion that Madeleine might have died in the apartment, or that the official story contained holes, was either marginalized or dismissed outright. Instead, public sympathy was funneled into one accepted version of events. Questioning it was not only controversial, it became almost taboo. The involvement of the British government added further weight to this narrative. Diplomatic channels were activated, media coordination intensified, and the McCanns were shielded from the kind of scrutiny most families would have faced under similar circumstances. To Portugal's investigators, the message was clear. Pressing too hard on uncomfortable evidence risked political backlash. Meanwhile, critical forensic leads, alerts from cadaver dogs, traces of biological material, discrepancies in witness statements, were downplayed or ignored in mainstream coverage. Instead, the public was offered emotive appeals, candlelight vigils, and carefully staged interviews. The case was no longer only an investigation. It had become a media spectacle. This intertwining of media influence and political pressure profoundly shaped the trajectory of the case. Independent investigators argue that what could have been a straightforward, evidence-driven inquiry was instead redirected, constrained by forces that valued perception over truth. For many, the disappearance of Madeleine McCann became less about the search for a missing child and more about sustaining a narrative that the world had already chosen to believe. 17 years after that night in Praia da Luz, the Madeleine McCann case remains defined not by clarity, but by contradictions. Beneath the polished surface of the abduction story lies a series of unresolved hypotheses, questions that investigators, analysts, and the public have never been able to silence. The most persistent alternative theory suggests that Madeleine may not have been taken from the apartment at all. Instead, she might have died inside apartment 5A through accident, medical emergency, or circumstances still unknown, and that subsequent actions were taken to conceal what had happened. Supporting this are the alerts from cadaver dogs, the traces of blood in the McCann's rental car, and the fact that no physical evidence of forced entry has ever been established. Then there are the contradictions in the timeline. Members of the Tapas 7 gave detailed accounts of checking on the children at intervals, yet their statements conflict on who checked when, which doors were open or closed, and what exactly they observed. These may appear as small inconsistencies, but together they form a web of uncertainty. To investigators like Stellander and Amaral, these gaps suggest not mere lapses in memory, but deliberate uniformity designed to preserve a fragile narrative. Other unresolved elements stem from the treatment of forensic evidence. Why were the cadaver dog alerts minimized? Why were certain biological traces dismissed without full explanation? Why was the state of the apartment so calm, so undisturbed, never reconciled with the violence implied by abduction? These are not minor oversights. They are missing pieces of a puzzle that refuses to come together. The broader question is why these anomalies have never been pursued to their conclusion. Independent investigators point to the immense weight of media and political influence. Once the abduction story was launched worldwide, it became the foundation on which public sympathy, governmental support, and international pressure rested. To challenge it was to risk unraveling not just a narrative, but the trust of millions who had invested emotionally in Madeleine's rescue. And so, the unresolved hypotheses remain in the shadows. Did Madeleine's death occur quietly inside that apartment? Were steps taken in panic to hide the truth? Were friends complicit through silence? Or did the investigation itself, constrained by politics and narrative control, simply fail to see the full picture? What is certain is that the abduction theory has never answered these questions, and until those contradictions are confronted, the disappearance of Madeleine McCann will remain less a solved case than an open wound, marked by doubt, secrecy, and the lingering sense that the truth is still out there, waiting to be told. The disappearance of Madeleine McCann is more than a single unsolved case. It is a story that reveals the fragile boundary between truth, perception, and power. After 17 years, the questions remain louder than the answers. Was Madeleine truly abducted by a stranger? Did her death occur inside the apartment, later hidden beneath layers of silence and carefully crafted narratives? Or has the truth been buried beneath media spectacle and political pressure? Independent investigators like Bernd Stellander, Gonzalo Amaral, and Richard D. Hall did not always agree on every detail, but their work converges on one haunting point. The official story is incomplete. Stellander's behavioral analysis suggested ritual, secrecy, and guilt. Amaral's forensic scrutiny pointed to biological traces and a staged narrative. Hall's critique of the media exposed how perception was shaped, locked, and defended at the expense of evidence. Together, they revealed cracks in the foundation of a case the world thought it understood. For the public, the lesson is sobering. Media can amplify sympathy, but it can also construct myths. Politics can protect families, but it can also silence uncomfortable truths. And in the midst of it all, a 3-year-old girl, Madeleine, remains missing, her fate obscured by a storm of conflicting accounts. Perhaps that is why this case refuses to fade. It is not only about one child, but about how justice itself can be derailed when emotion, narrative, and influence collide. To this day, the image of Madeleine's face reminds us of what is at stake. The pursuit of truth, no matter how complex, inconvenient, or painful. And so we ask you, the viewer, which perspective do you find most convincing? The behavioral lens of Stellander, the forensic skepticism of Amaral, or the media critique of Hall? Could it be that each contains a fragment of a larger hidden truth? Share your thoughts below. Continue the conversation, because until the contradictions are faced and the silence is broken, Madeleine's story will remain unsolved, and justice still waiting.